Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined by Jonathan Neufeld, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy and upcoming Chair of the Philosophy Department at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina, where he is also the person who runs the aesthetics work group. There is the T-shirt and the Danto squares on there. So Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back, Brandon. Thanks.
Yes, I'm very excited to talk to you again. And so I'm talking to you as part of this mini series I'm doing about Taylor Swift re-recording her back catalog and looking at the aesthetic and metaphysical and ethical and political consequences of that project. And I'm talking to you to talk about the political angle and the ethical angle of that project, because you work in the politics of aesthetics, essentially, or the interface of those two things. And when I've talked to you before for this series, we talked about your paper, Aesthetic Disobedience, from the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And I want to talk about what Taylor Swift is doing precisely in terms of aesthetic disobedience and whether it can be thought of as a form of aesthetic disobedience or something maybe related to it, or if it's problematic in those terms. So I guess the place to start is just to invite you to just like briefly summarize the main points of your view, and then we can start thinking through what Taylor Swift is doing in those terms.
Sure. Yeah, cool. So aesthetic disobedience is supposed to be a sort of parallel to civil disobedience. So when people talk about innovations in art, often they talk in terms of revolutions. And this seems overly dramatic and almost always false to me, that someone is overturning all of the norms of a system like you do in revolution. Sometimes maybe people do this, but usually what people do is sort of target norms that they want to change within an artistic practice, within the art world, and they'll break certain norms in order to draw attention to the ways in which they think that the practice should go more generally. Much like you break a certain law in order to draw attention to some value that we share in a society that shows that the law is not serving either the law that you're breaking or some other law, right? You can have indirect civil disobedience. So too, you can have indirect aesthetic disobedience, right? You're not always protesting the rule that you're breaking. You might be protesting something else. And so acts of aesthetic disobedience do interesting things. They target the rules of the art world. And they do this through aesthetic acts of various kinds. And so the claim that I make that will be important to this discussion, I think, is that those acts can be just artistic acts. You can break compositional rules in music, or you can break formal rules in painting or whatever, or you can put a bed on the wall and paint it and call it a painting. Is it really a painting? You can do all sorts of things that are obviously aesthetic, but any citizen of the art world, I claim, can engage in acts of aesthetic disobedience. So you can intervene in ways of listening. You can intervene in ways of looking at things. You can intervene in the economic structures that govern a practice in order to sort of shock people out of viewing a thing or listening to a thing or apprehending a thing, whatever, in the way that they typically do in artworks in the way that they typically do. So we can shock people out of doing the things that we don't want them to do within the art world in a variety of ways. And I think lots and lots of different kinds of acts count as aesthetic disobedience. So is that clear enough?
Yes, absolutely. And so turning to Taylor Swift with respect to that, at least on the surface, it appears that there is a way to interpret what she's doing in re-recording her back catalog as in line with what you just said about aesthetic disobedience, right? That there's a particular norm in the music world of not just releasing an album a second time, a re-recording of it. Now, one thing to note is that, in the 60s, this was a somewhat common practice of re-recording your songs are re-recording an album, especially if you were signed to a new label. You re-record your greatest hits from the previous one, your previous label, and then release it as if they were the originals. But that practice went out of fashion in the 70s, and it's only been in the 2000s, and only really a few times in the 2000s that I can find where this has started happening. And so there seems to be a norm against repetition, and she's violating that norm. She's working very much within legal norms, because you can re-record your stuff after a certain period, given how recording contracts work. And so she's violating a norm in order to draw attention to greater injustice within the music industry, which has to do with perhaps artists not owning their works. And so again, at least on the surface, it seems like what she's doing fits the category of aesthetic disobedience. And I wanted to know, is that right? Or are there sort of problems or nuances that are there that complicate the picture at all?
Yeah, so it's for sure on the surface it's right, and it's a super interesting case, right? Because it's so listening to these albums again, you're it's a repetition, but it's not supposed to be the same thing, right? As you know, and as you argue, like it's a new thing, right? And so you want to you want to listen to it. You want to listen for differences if there are differences. If there are not differences, you still want to listen to it because it's Taylor's, right? And so you have all sorts of reasons for listening to the same thing again that are sort of unusual to how we think about listening to the same thing again, like popping the same CD again and listening to it, right? That's not what you're doing. And though it shares lots of characteristics with that. And so since it shares all these characteristics with it, it's drawing your attention to the differences. What are the differences, right? So assume they sound exactly alike. The difference is ownership. The difference is Taylor Swift's control over her own art. The difference is Taylor Swift's autonomy. It's her independence. It's her growing up. It's all sorts of things, right? And so it's to use the legal structure of recording and to sort of claim the power of the legal structure of recording to make these new aesthetic objects for us to listen to is an interesting way to go, right? So you say it's like appropriation art, and that seems exactly right to me. And so, but it's funny to appropriate yourself within a pop context, and then to advertise yourself in just the same way that you always advertise yourself, right? New thing dropping from Taylor. By the way, it's a rethinking of these first albums because as a sort of act of rebellion against the people whose thumb I was formerly under, and so it looks so. Those are all the reasons why I think it looks like a nice example of aesthetic disobedience. And it also draws attention to the complexity of the aesthetic, right? The legal structure counts as it's like a candidate for having us look at and hear something and experience something differently, right? So manipulation of the legal structure is aesthetic on my view here, which is a broad view and a different view of aesthetic than lots of people have. So, but this is part of the aesthetic disobedience business, right? The thing that worries me a little bit. So those are reasons for. The part of what I like about the view, part of the reason that I advocated for a view of aesthetic disobedience is I think that the part of the attraction of it is it puts forward what I call a democratic ethos of art worlds. Anybody can change the art world in a variety of different ways, and so it sort of reveals the variety of ways that we can push on the rules of the art world in order to sort of change it together and to bring people along in changing it. And I'm not sure that it's a good instance of that because it's Taylor Swift is able to do this because Taylor Swift is now Taylor Swift, right? She's got a ton of money. She is famous. She has the power to just sort of assert herself in this way first. Second, the way she's asserting herself, and now this is calling into question whether it's really disobedient, right? Is like she's just becoming the owner of her stuff in a way. And she's becoming the owner of her stuff in just the way that the system that she's protesting allows her to become the owner of the stuff. So it's unusual to become an owner in this way. And so that's neat. But as a mode of protest of the structure within which she's working, like she just kind of ends up on top of the same structure again, right? So part of me is like, it's first of all, the only reason she can do what she's doing is because she's Taylor Swift. And second, the thing she's doing is moving within the same structure that she's protesting, and now she's someone who's in power with regard to her own stuff within the system. And there are feminist reasons for saying it's really interesting that she as a woman does this in an industry that doesn't have a lot of women taking exactly that kind of control. So that's a reason for saying, okay, not just a move within the same system. But like from afar, I worry that it's a move within the very same structure of the art world, and it's a move that people recognize, and it's just, I don't know, it's Taylorified or something, and so it doesn't it doesn't strike me as being a model of democratic disobedience, democratically spirited disobedience. So that's the sort of worry I have lurking in the background of that is like Adorno and Benjamin, right? But we don't need to go there right now.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the sort of related not to the Adorno and Benjamin bit, but I mean, maybe we get into that later. I don't know. But related to that is sort of a dismissive way of looking at this, or maybe a dismissive way, is that it's a multimillionaire going after a billion-dollar company, right? And so, we do have sort of an underdog going after the overdog, or the little guy going after the big guy. But the little guy in this case is so astronomically above
Right.
what we typically think of as the little guy, that do you think that complicates things or makes it troubling at all? Because I mean, if the whole point of aesthetic disobedience is meant to be in some way democratic or be infused with the democratic ethos, then who is she helping other than other people at sort of a similar status as her? Snoop Dogg says that he's going to do what Taylor Swift is doing. And so it's another millionaire going after a billion-dollar company in order to enrich themselves even further. Right.
Right. And I guess if that's the only thing that we are looking at, then that is a worry. But of course, that's not the only thing that we're looking at. We're looking at actual works by Taylor Swift and how we listen to those works and how the audience is to take those works and what the audience is paying attention to when they understand those works. So it has these audience ramifications because the audience is now paying attention to economic structures of song production in a way they weren't before. Moreover, they're connecting those in the way we do with all art, right? We connect the things that the art is paying attention to with the content of the work in interesting ways, and with, in this case, with the Taylor Swift's long message about her own independence or her own autonomy or her own growing up, or like the Bildungsroman that is the star character of Taylor Swift, right? And so it's a shift within that story, and that story is interesting to audience members because they can see themselves in it, because they can do all the things that one does with a work of art, whether or not the work of art was produced by a multimillionaire, whether or not the work of art was produced by a certain kind of jerk, right? Or what have you, right? So the works are rich in the way that works are rich, contentful, formful, and aesthetically rich, in the way that they are anyway, right? And so Swift's starness and richness play into that, but it would just be kind of weird and disappointing and reductive to say that it's exhausted in that, right? Even though it's tempting to say, um, congratulations on achieving your new power within the game, right? But same game. So it must not quite be that, because we still have to listen to the songs, right? So the works are doing something, and so I think that's part of where the that and the relationship to the audience is where the sort of democratic push has got to lie, right? Or we have to pay attention to that. We might still be disappointed, um, but the explanation, the worrying explanation, can't be the end of the story, right?
Yeah, and related to the point you raised a couple minutes ago about sort of how the audience is engaging with the work and becoming aware of these things, right? There are like fan guides for how to avoid listening to the original recordings on Spotify, right? That here's how you screw with the algorithm in such a way that you only get Taylor's versions, so that Taylor gets the money,
Nice.
and whoever owns the originals doesn't get money from listening to this. And so like now fans have become savvy with respect to that. But again, do you think it's a problem that, their sort of savviness there and their awareness of the economics of it is still a way of making a rich person even richer? But I mean, I guess the alternative is you make an even richer corporation who has been cast as evil by Taylor Swift, essentially, making them richer, right? And so it's, the evil billion-dollar corporation or the millionaire Taylor Swift, who we really, really, really like and who's enriched our lives in all sorts of ways. And so I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it can't be the case that someone becomes successful, and then they're no longer capable of participating in democracy, right? So the worry is how are the worrisome structures, the sort of, yeah, the worrisome structures sort of successfully being addressed by whatever gesture, or is it like conceivable that we can have a new light shed on some troubling structures in our art world by such a gesture? And the case seems to be clearly yes in this case. I think it's yes. But then when you start piling on well, it's just another, really what's happened is Taylor has just put Taylor Swift has just put Taylor Swift in the spot of corporate overlord over her own songs. And that's cool, but it's still a corporate overlord of her songs, right? And if corporate overlorddom is the worry, then it seems like nothing has been done. But in order to get past that, it seems to me that you need to engage. So I can easily imagine that being the case with the artists that you mentioned in the 60s, where you're moving from one corporate overlord to another corporate overlord, and the only way you can do it is to utilize the control over the songs that the author has, and then you tell them to do the work, right? There seems to be a clear difference between Taylor Swift stepping into that role and somebody else telling Taylor Swift to now please allow them to be in that role, so do this thing first. Second, there's something like I keep wanting to zero in on the particular thing that we're talking about, which is songs by this particular historical person, Taylor Swift, because I think that's what does the gesture. It's not the move abstractly described. It's that Taylor Swift is recording her songs as a 30 whatever year old, and she's re-recording them, re-singing them, and at the same time communicating with her fans about what she's doing. And it's such a Taylor Swifty thing to do that you can't sort of abstract the move away. And this is what, by the way, this is what good acts of aesthetic disobedience do, right? In their interesting particularity, in their aesthetic gesture, in their singularity, right? They do this, they call attention to these general problems, right? This is why I think aesthetic is the right word to use for the kind of disobedience that we do. But then when we describe particular moves of aesthetic disobedience, then it's like, well, why is this aesthetically disobedient in the way that it is? And then we go and describe, like you point to the thing, and you engage in a sort of deep and detailed criticism of this particular thing. And so it's like when you start describing it in the abstract, then you start worrying, oh gosh, it's just Taylor putting herself in the position of controller. And isn't that problematic? It's like, well, what's that like in the case of this in particular, right? That's the question that we're compelled to ask in cases of aesthetic disobedience. So look at this. You've talked me into being more hopeful about this. So.
Good. One thing that you mentioned is just sort of how Taylor Swift this is for Taylor Swift to do something like this, and that I think feeds into the question of her identity as an artist and her brand as an artist, and how fans respond to her, or the version of her that she's put out there in the world, and in some sense she's tried to have some control over, right? Which was, I think, precisely her concern and criticism when Scooter Braun's company, Ithaca Holdings, bought her albums, is this is a person who's tried to harm my reputation so much for so long that she probably would have been more okay had another corporate entity
Right.
bought it out from under her, right? Her back catalog, than this particular person. And it was that particular act, right, that motivated this whole project. And so, yeah, the particularities of it really, really matter in a way, right? In his connection with Kanye West and her history with Kanye West, and the attempt to undo her reputation by secretly recording her and then releasing an edited version of it that makes her look like she's done something wrong and is wrong for calling Kanye out. So I don't, the particularities really, really, really deeply matter.
Yeah, and this is, and when you start, so I've only listened to a little bit of the new versions of the old albums, but part of what struck me, I'm trying to remember what song I just listened to that made me think of this, and I'll think of it in a second. What's the title of the second album?
That she's released is Red.
First album that she released.
Fearless.
Fearless. So Fearless, from Fearless. If you listen to that, so I'm listening to that song with this stuff in the background, and listening to how, like, it's more different than you let on, I think, in the description that I've read of the article that I think is not out yet. Is that true?
It comes out next year. Yeah.
Okay. So it's her voice is significantly different, right? Her voice sounds older. Her voice sounds more mature and more thoughtful, right? So it seems like she's the act of her presenting her past to you, is clearly through a more mature lens, and that this is an act of representation of myself from the past is really clear right on the face of it, right? And that's bound up with the media representation of her, the media misrepresentation of her by Ithaca Guy and Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. That she's not just sort of defiantly giving the same thing again, right? She's thinking about that thing again. Is what it sounds like to me when I listen to it, right? Her vocals are softer. There's much less sort of teenage fry in it. It's much breathier, her voice. It doesn't, and this is partly a function of her being however many years older, but she's clearly doing it on purpose, right? So it's a sort of mellowed lyricism. The balance of the instruments, I think, is better and more polished in a way. So it's this. And now I'm really curious to listen and compare a whole bunch of them to see the ways in which the particular songs reflect her sort of looking back on the past and giving you a different picture of the past in a way, or of her looking back on the past. So back to looking at the particularities of the thing, that what gets triggered is not just, it doesn't seem to me just the economic taking control of the past. Like it's a way of re-recording the past so that it's really similar, and it sounds like a mimic cover, in Magnus's view, right? Magnus, McGuire, and Magnus. and but it clearly isn't, and that it isn't a mere mimic, right? That it's this does this really sort of interesting critical work, is something that would be easy to miss if you weren't paying attention to it. And I think, and she makes you pay attention to it because she's contextualized it in advance online. She tells everybody that she's going to do it, so that you come to it prepared to listen again to the thing that you thought you knew, but here it is, right? So there's, I'm not sure what I'm saying. I lost it's an interesting, the gesture is an interesting aesthetic political gesture that depends on all of this sort of uh, preparation and a bunch of moves in things other than making the song itself. But the whole point is remaking the song itself again, right? So yeah, that's what's interesting, I think, about Swift, which wouldn't be interesting about the '60s. Oh, there's new record labels, so we have to re-record these things because we don't have access to them. Move, right? Does that because it's such a it's a Swiftian move.
Yeah, it's so particular, and I mean, just the act of re-recording one song is an arduous task, and then
Yeah,
re-recording an album plus bonus tracks
yeah,
based on songs that she maybe demoed back then but never released, or fully recorded, and then doing that with the second album, and now presumably doing it with four more
right.
albums, right? It's that arduousness and sort of the technical precision and the craft and all of the million decisions that are going into that. Yeah, it's something that, if you take the sort of the broader scale, is just going to be entirely missed out. But I think you're absolutely right that it's in the particularities that this thing gets really, really complicated in a really interesting aesthetic way.
Yeah, and this is part of what I wondered about when I was thinking about the your characterization of this as appropriation art, and as a kind of conceptual art, right? That if we think about it, it's tempting if you think about it that way to see the re-recording as a single move, right? So I have one aesthetic gesture, and that's re-recording all of these albums, right? And but then when you and if it were that, then the concept seems sort of exhausted in the gesture. Like you read all of the everything that Taylor says about this. You read everything that her fans say about this, and you sort of get the point, right? But it turns out not to be the case, because the so I'll leave the extra songs aside, right? The albums themselves, like when you start listening to each song, which is about different sort of personal moments in Swift's life, till later on when she starts taking a more narrative and distance mode and all of this, right? Like the move, that big move that's tempting to just sort of collapse into a single aesthetic gesture, sort of splinters into a whole bunch of different ones, right? And it makes you listen to each of those works differently, each of those songs differently, makes you characterize the albums differently, right? Which again is not surprising because like the part of the aesthetic character is her looking back on a whole bunch of different periods in her life, and now like telling you a new glossy history of them in a way, making a ton of money off doing this again, but putting her again reflecting on these things as she's doing them, which is a very, very different gesture than was made in each of these songs when she first recorded them, right? So it's odd to add a 30-year-old, odd. It's something to add a 30-something-year-old's reflection on a teenage breakup song, right? And to sing it so that it sounds sufficiently alike that you're going to listen to it, and if you're not really paying attention, you'll just hear it. But this is 30-year-old Taylor now singing this song, right? And recording it and re-recording it, and making a new master of it. So it's not just like a performance, right? It's something else. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's really interesting. Um, So I'm not sure what to. So just to put a point on it, it's tempting to think of this as a single conceptual gesture over a bucket of works. And I think it is that, but the single gesture reshapes each individual work in ways that you have to actually go listen. So it makes it an aesthetically diverse gesture.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that the act of reflection on her earlier selves, right? If we want to put it in those terms, of those earlier stretches of her life, right, is at the same time an act of reclaiming it for herself,
Yeah,
right? That this is
right,
mine now, right? This is
right.
not yours. You have old Taylor. This is new Taylor. And this is the stuff that I point to as mine.
And this is so I guess and this is why it's so so imagine you just bought your own back catalog like lots of other successful artists do, right? That is so maybe that's what. So when I claimed earlier that one worries I worry that this is just a move within the same game, right? Now I'm the boss, haha. That the act of re-recording and being the boss and making all of the money that comes with it, right? Is uh, is is different. The kind of act with all of the arduous artistic gestures that you pointed to earlier, with all of the work, with all of, and more important, I think, with all of the different bits of reception that are sort of required for this, right? So if you're to hear this new work, when you hear this new work, and there's this normative push for you to listen to the new work and not the old works, right? Like the old works are in your ear, right? You're gonna, if you're a real Swift fan, you'll hear all of those differences. You'll hear the lack of vocal fry in the new version of Fearless, right? It's like 20% as much vocal fry as in the first one, right? And the like you'll hear all that anyway, right? So you don't need to. What there was a Pitchfork review of Red that said finding differences is like the Where's Waldo of music. I don't think that's quite right, right? You're going to hear the differences anyway, and you're going to hear them under the aspect of the reclamation, right? So the differences are going to be right there for the fan. And so so that gesture, that reclamation project, seems like different in, maybe it's different in kind than like buying your old back catalog and then saying, hey, now I own this, and you say put it out on your own label or something, and it's the same thing again. Um, that is, it doesn't strike me as this. It doesn't strike me as an aesthetic move. Um, and my own self is shouting at me from back here. But or at least the same kind of aesthetic move that Swift is doing here. So maybe that's a way to solve a move within the game problem, and you do it aesthetically. Exciting. So
Yeah. That if an artist buys their back catalog and just re-releases it, right, that it's not a transformative project in any
right,
way. Whereas what
right.
Taylor Swift seems to be doing is through the improved, in her mind at least, vocals, and in your mind also, as a
Yeah,
critic of these things, right?
yeah, I don't even know if improved, but clearly different, right?
Yeah,
It's a different kind of thing. So
yeah, that
like
that it's a transformative project.
right. And so the I wonder to what extent I'm now leaning on that difference though. So I would be suspicious of me given what I said at the beginning, which is you can do this in lots of ways, even if it's sonically identical or whatever. Like I've been saying how they're so different over the last bits. And the person who was shouting at me who was shouting at me a second ago, is a little worried about. So imagine you this is the problem of thinking about these in context-free terms, right? I'm trying to imagine an artist now who bought her own back catalog and re-releases them under her own label or whatever, and says, "Now they're mine, finally at long last," and then it's just the same thing again. Like you can imagine telling a story where, so imagine that Taylor Swift succeeded tried and succeeded to make all of the songs identical that she's re-recorded. So really, they are sonically identical, right? Like, are we depending on her having done the work and played, right? Is that the transformative thing? So is what I said earlier, that maybe if you like, you can make a purely economic move. Say you can make all sorts of moves. They don't have to be moves within what you would normally think of as like formal moves within the art world or something like that. You can call attention to economic structure, and then you have people look at it under that aspect, and that transforms the that might be an act of aesthetic disobedience, right? But if that's the case, then this doesn't seem to be a good example of that, because she's doing all of this normal, formal, performative work in making a gesture of aesthetic disobedience. So I'll ask you, do you think if it were sonically identical, that it would be, do you think that I was just relying on the sonic non-identity to make it a compelling case?
Well, I mean, you're focusing on the actual object, right? The actual album, the actual recordings, which are
Yeah.
sonically different. I mean, again, as you mentioned, I think you're absolutely right that if you're just sort of casually listening and not paying too close attention, or you didn't grow up with her music, or you weren't a super Swiftie before, you probably just wouldn't be able to tell if it was the Taylor's version of Fearless or the original 2008 version.
Yeah.
Right. But if you did grow up with that music, I think you're absolutely right that it's not a Where's Waldo situation. It just is like, oh, there's clearly a difference here. Right. Like you're the aficionado and just, oh, there's something slightly off, or, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. And but with that said, right, I think that let's go the hypothetical where she's attempting to do what Def Leppard attempting to do and re-recording a couple of their tracks, right, which was complete sonic fidelity to the originals. If she were doing that, I still think it would be aesthetically transformative, right? Precisely because it is a new act of performance. It is a new act of producing. And, even if it does involve auto tuning and pitch shifting and correcting, et cetera, it's still a different product due to the means of production, due to the history of production. If you're thinking of, like Gerald Levinson's account of what distinguishes musical works. And obviously we're applying that from the classical case to pop music and recordings, but I'm totally on board with that. And so I do think that it would be equally transformative, although transformative in a different sort of way. So not identically transformative, but equally transformative if they were sonic duplicates, than the actual case where there are subtle nuances and differences, and shadings, et cetera.
But so if she had just bought her back catalog, or something like that, then this would, my dog has entered the room. So hey guys, how you doing?
It's not a ghost. Good.
It is not a ghost. so, um, so that would be a different, for Swift in particular, it would be a different kind of gesture. And I'm not sufficiently good on my feet to know who has bought their back catalog and re-released it in interesting ways, to see whether it can be the same sort of emancipatory gesture, right, or something like that, or I mean, it doesn't seem like a transformative gesture in the use that you just gave it.
And further, it's not an act of disobedience at all, right? It's right. An act of obedience, right? It's that I have the money now to buy this. I bought it. Now I release it and I make money off it. So now I go from, a player on the football team to the coach. Now I'm the owner somehow, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a residue of that with her being able to re-record everything, with her having the wherewithal to fund a really good recording of it and to do all of that, right? So there's something of the sort of obedient game that's being played. It just seems to be it seems to be different in sort of interesting ways. And so there's a thing that so there are people. So I'm thinking about how transformative it is, right? So Ani DeFranco, right? Just made rather than work with, and you said Amy Mann releases, self-releases. Is that what you said when we were talking before? So Ani DeFranco made her own record company. Jay-Z started his own record company. So there are all sorts of ways of of gaining control over your own masters from the beginning, in a way. So do you think there's something, it seems to me, I'll just say, it seems to me there's something important about the shift from being under the thumb of Universal or whoever she is under. What is it? What's her label?
Yeah, so she's now under Universal, and
Right.
a stipulation of that contract is she owns all of the masters.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But she was previously under Big Machine Records, where she did not own the masters, and they sold it off to Screw to Bronze Company.
Yeah. Right. 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 Good. So there seems to be, again, back to the sort of particular case, like what modes of resistance are possible given, right? And this is so a way to keep it being, so even though it looks like a move within the rules, it's an what we would need to show is that the particular contrast between being under the thumb of being under the thumb and manipulated and so vulnerable to a kind of manipulation that's particularly pernicious to Taylor Swift in particular. The move from being that to reclaiming in the face of that and because of that, right? That move is a kind of transformative move within the record industry, or within the pop music art world, right? And I guess I can imagine that that's the case, and I can imagine all sorts of interesting ways that that's the case, and I can imagine going into the kinds of descriptions that I do of the transformation that it involves of both her and audience and reception of her work, and that's the kind of work that you would need to do to allay the worries that we sort of had at the beginning about whether this is just a particularly successful, famous, rich person getting her way in an interesting way within the rules of the system, right? And so, like, I think we're on our way to that. But I think I don't know enough about the about the history and the structure of this in order to make a judgment at the end of the day. I'm hopeful, and I like listening, so that's good.
Yeah, awesome. So I think we'll leave it there on that hopeful note with a question mark, right? The hopeful question mark. So Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me. This was a really fun discussion.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, Brandon. Thanks for thinking to invite me about something I don't know a lot about, but I like talking about. So
That's what I've done with everyone. So
appreciate it.
welcome to the team.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks a
Thanks.
lot.